John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on the 3rd of January 1892. He and his brother Hilary experienced a difficult childhood. When Tolkien was just 4, they lost their father, Arthur, to rheumatic fever. As a widow with low income, his mother Mabel homeschooled the brothers and played a vital role in their early education and development. Tolkien was a smart young boy with a fascination and thirst for languages. Tolkien sat the entrance exam for King Edward's School, Birmingham, and passed. From the autumn of 1900, for a fee of £12 a year, Tolkien would be educated in an environment that would help fulfil his academic potential.
Going to King Edward's was vitally important to Tolkien. He was an exceptionally talented boy. King Edward's offered him a vast amount of scope and also the company of other boys who were similarly talented, which was probably quite hard for Tolkien to find.
Not only did he play rugby, but he was a leading light in the debating society and the literary society. He was the life and soul, really. And he missed the school a great deal, I think, when he finally had to leave.
At the age of just 11, Tolkien and his brother Hilary lose their mother, Mabel, to diabetes. Grief-stricken, he plunges himself into school life more energetically than before. Academically, he excels, but in 1905 meets his intellectual rival, Christopher Wiseman.
Tolkien met his greatest friend at King Edward's, Christopher Wiseman, on the rugby pitch. A musician, a mathematician, quite different from Tolkien. They developed such a strong bond on the rugby field that they called themselves the Great Twin Brethren, which was a phrase from the Lays of Ancient Rome by Lord Macaulay.
They also were friendly rivals in the school, both being very academic boys. Wiseman had a formidable intellect, and he was interested in a lot of the things that Tolkien was getting interested in, languages. I think he was looking at Egyptian and had taught himself hieroglyphics.
Tolkien and Wiseman must have helped define each other through their teenage years because they would argue strongly about all their beliefs in life.
Wiseman was a very talented musician. Tolkien was supposed to be tone deaf, but that didn't stop him getting on.
Tolkien also befriends son of the headmaster, Rob Gilson. Tolkien, Wiseman and Gilson form a strong bond which will last throughout their school years and beyond. Outside of King Edward's, Tolkien's life is about to change yet again.
Tolkien was living in lodgings with his brother Hilary, and when he was 16, he met fellow lodger Edith Bratt, who was 19 at the time. And she was a beautiful young girl, talented pianist, and also an orphan. And the two of them bonded on their shared sadnesses, but also on their hopes and dreams. The difficulty for Ronald, as she called him, and Edith, was that he was a Roman Catholic and she was an Anglican.
Tolkien's guardian, Father Francis Morgan, a Catholic priest, feels this is a major divide and also believes that Edith will distract Tolkien from his attempts to get into Oxford University.
Father Francis Morgan forbade them from seeing each other or even from communicating. He was thrown back upon his friendships at King Edward's, and it was this final phase of his time here that he really began to flourish and make the place his own. He and his friends ruled the roost.
Making the most of his final year at King Edward's and the friendships he has formed, Tolkien and his peers create an informal society. These young intellectuals gather in the school library and do what they are forbidden to do: brew tea. Outside of school hours, they meet in a cafe at Barrow's Stores in Birmingham, and so, self-mockingly, they call themselves the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, or the TCBS for short.
The core of the TCBS was probably Tolkien and Wiseman, and the others gravitated around them. There was Robert Quilter Gilson, the son of the headmaster here. Rob was a cultured and sociable chap. He was perhaps the social glue of the group. He would welcome anyone and find common cause with them. A gentle, artistic fellow who loved to sketch.
He was a gifted artist and had ambitions to be an architect.
There was a late arrival, Geoffrey Bache Smith, who was fascinated by mythology, Celtic mythology, so this gave him common ground with Tolkien. It was another of Tolkien's passions.
Smith was quite an accomplished and advanced poet who recommended contemporary poetry to Tolkien. When he started writing poetry, Tolkien was, to a certain extent, inspired by Smith and the wider group. And that was really the beginnings of Tolkien as a writer.
From the beginnings, which were mostly about fun, later on, during the war years, this developed into a fellowship from which each of them drew tremendous strength and comfort.
Later that year, Tolkien's time at King Edward's comes to an end, and he begins his first term at Oxford, having successfully gained entrance. On the eve of his 21st birthday and his independence from Father Francis Morgan, Tolkien writes to Edith, and less than a week later, they are reunited. Edith is engaged to marry another man, but despite almost certain ridicule, she agrees to break the engagement to be with her Ronald. Over the next few months, a growing sense of trouble brews across Europe, and on the 28th of June, 1914, everything changes. Gavrilo Princip is arrested for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A diplomatic crisis ensues, and within weeks, Europe's major powers are at war. Germany invades Belgium, and Britain declares war on Germany. Parliament issues a call to arms from the British public.
There isn't a rush to the colours straight away. It becomes much more obvious that people are willing to join up when atrocity stories start to emerge. Then you get a much more concerted rush to join.
There was an air of excitement about the war. There was a naive sense that this would allow young men to fulfil their potential in a way that wasn't possible in peacetime. There was a tremendous sense of patriotism and a sense of duty towards whatever England or Britain stood for.
They are attracted to the idea of a settling of accounts with the Germans. At least some of them will be. On the whole, they thought they were going to give the Germans a bloody nose.
The Germans had been dastardly and needed to be dealt with and shown their place.
Men join up out of economic necessity, and you'll find that in any war. Life is not very exciting, and the romance and colour of joining the army and of being part of something very big indeed, I'm sure had some allure. And they see things in rather romantic ways, which of course is doomed to fail. We all know what the First World War turns into. It's not a war of movement, of dash and elan. It's not cavalry charges and distant trumpets. I'm afraid it's the pitter-patter of machine gun fire and the crump of artillery that's going to dominate. So they, I think, have expectations about what the war will be like. And I think their main emotion was, will it be over before I can get to France?
Tolkien, whose reading covered ancient heroic literature, that is surprisingly frank about what happens in war, went into the war much more open-eyed. He described himself as a young man with too much imagination, so he did not relish battle in any sense.
I think that applies to not just men like Tolkien who fought in it, but also the politicians and the generals that directed it. I think a lot of people understood that this war could be terrible.
What you get in the letters between Gilson, Tolkien and Wiseman, and then in Smith's poetry, is a serious determination to do their duty and that they should be prepared to give their lives. A realistic appreciation that this is a dark time and that they've got to come through it.
G.B. Smith and Rob Gilson both joined the army in 1914. Tolkien's brother Hilary signs up as a bugler, and Christopher Wiseman joins the Navy. Tolkien, however, faces a dilemma.
Tolkien was in a difficult position when war broke out. He had a year of his degree at Oxford to run, and Tolkien needed a degree badly because he wanted to pursue an academic career. He didn't have any money in his family, unlike Gilson, and therefore, having committed 3 years to the degree, it was very important that he complete it. So he discovered a scheme whereby he could undergo some training in the Officer Training Corps whilst completing his degree, which he did triumphantly with a first at Oxford.
He follows good friend G.B. Smith into the Lancashire Fusiliers in the hope of being posted to the same battalion.
Tolkien was looking for something in the army through which he could use his particular talents, and his particular talents were languages and writing systems. He was fascinated by codes and so forth. So it was only natural that he would train up as a signaller.
It would have meant that Tolkien was exposed to the technology available at the time, and it must have interested him. So the use of the radio, the use of signals, of semaphore.
He learnt Morse code. He learned how to use signalling lamps, field telephones, which of course went on largely to be ineffective or not to work.
He became battalion signalling officer for his battalion. Tolkien had to oversee the communications of a battalion of between 600 and 1,000 men, depending on manpower at the time.
His basic job, of course, was to act as a link between the various layers of command, and that he would be responsible for incoming orders and making sure the right people got those. And of course, he'd be responsible for telling command further up the line about the situation on his sector.
So he was an absolute linchpin in a war which depended absolutely on how much information you had about your enemy's position.
In March of 1916, as his training nears its completion, both Tolkien and Edith become aware that he will soon be sent to the front. They marry, and just over 2 months later, Tolkien is shipped off to France. The two of them part, not knowing if they will ever see each other again. When Tolkien arrives at the front, the war has been raging for almost 2 years. The cost of the war is clear, the countryside is scarred, and the casualties high. After a virtual stalemate of trench warfare throughout 1915, and with a new wave of thousands of freshly trained recruits, it is clear the big push is imminent. Tolkien's battalion remains in reserve, but he fears for the lives of his old school friends who are at the front. Within a month of his arrival in France, the Allies launched the Somme offensive. At 7:30 a.m. on Saturday the 1st of July, the troops in the British front line go over the top. On the first day of the offensive alone, 20,000 men are killed, 35,000 are wounded, and over 2,000 are reported missing.
The first casualty was the plan. It started to fall apart very rapidly. Tragically, for the men caught out in the open, it was a death sentence. 1 in 5 men who went into combat on the 1st of July was killed.
It was the most disastrous day in the history of the British Army, and a tragedy for the entire country. There were villages that had lost all their young men.
It's marked as a loss of innocence. That the 20,000 that were killed represent a turning point in British consciousness, and the relationship perhaps between those who make decisions and those who are forced to carry them out.
Among the many men that are lost on that day, his dear friend and TCBS member, Robert Gilson.
He led his platoon over the top. took charge of his company, but was shot in the middle of no man's land.
He was in the fourth wave. He saw the first wave go in and fail, the second wave go in and fail, the third wave go in and fail. And he, as a part of the fourth wave, had to go in. And they still went. And that, I think, is the most poignant and probably the most tragic thing about the 1st of July 1916. That this generation had so much faith in their superiors, probably had so much commitment to their fellows that they were prepared to go, even though it meant certain death.
Tolkien heard about this after his first action on the Somme, a couple of weeks later, and he was devastated. It shook him to the foundations of his beliefs. He had, as all of the members of the TCBS had, built up their group as a fellowship with ideas and a spirit that had something to give to the world, in which all four of them were vital parts, and now one of them was dead. So what did that mean about their overall purpose and also his purpose?
Geoffrey Smith wrote him a letter in which clearly Smith experiences feelings of devastation and a sense that the fellowship had been broken. Rob would never become an architect. He would never fulfill his part in whatever they dreamed of.
And I think it took him quite some time to recover from that. The other two members, Wiseman and Smith, were determined to persuade him that no, the TCBS purpose continued, and I think eventually Tolkien took heart from that.
Tolkien writes to Rob's father, the headmaster at King Edward's School, to offer his condolences. The TCBS lost a bright young man, a talented artist, and most painfully of all, a dear friend. Tolkien's war has well and truly started, and over the coming months he is subject to the many hardships of trench warfare.
He spent his time in and out of the trenches. Battalions would be rotated from the front line to the reserve trenches to rest, as they laughably called it. But it wasn't really rest, it was training. And Tolkien talked about the universal weariness of all this war. But during this period, he was involved in 3 attacks. He was very fortunate not to have to go through the first day of the Somme. He was a few miles back from the front line at that time. His battalion moved forward for a second wave of attacks. They were launched against a village called Ovier, which had been the German front line. One of the first things that he encountered was complete chaos in the battlefield communications system. It was very primitive. It was only partly built, damaged by the fortunes of battle. He had signallers going across no man's land, carrying flares to say, "We have arrived." Further flares, "We have taken prisoners." They carried pigeons. Pigeons were about the most reliable method of communication. One of Tolkien's signallers won a military medal for managing to get his pigeons across no man's land and do the job correctly.
The attack is a success, and many prisoners are captured. Of all the combat Tolkien encounters, one of the most significant battles is also one of his last, an attack on Regina Trench.
This was in October, by which time the battlefield had been reduced to mud. The attack had been delayed by heavy rain, but on October the 21st there was a cold snap, so the ground was frozen hard and the attack was able to go ahead. He saw violent death. He also saw and felt extreme terror. He never, as far as we know, described at length what trench warfare was like, but he summed it up in 2 words in one of his letters, and this was animal horror. it would reduce you from humanity and turn you into a wretched beast, desperate only to cower and survive. And it's very interesting if you look in The Lord of the Rings, whenever the characters are in situations of extreme fear, they're always described as stooping and stupefied, unmanned by terror.
A lot of British trenches were deliberately uncomfortable because the generals wanted the men to believe that they were only temporary, that they would be advancing beyond this, that this wasn't their home.
Out on the Western Front, Tolkien feels isolated from home, and letters to and from Edith are a lifeline. For reasons of strategic importance, Tolkien is forbidden from sharing his location in his letters, so he devises a code of dots to keep Edith informed of where he is.
He simply found the letters of the alphabet within what he wrote to her and put a dot over the relevant ones to spell out the name of the place where he was currently located. And Edith kept a map on her wall and pins to show where he was at that time.
After the successful attack on Regina Trench, the battalion is withdrawn from the front and paraded in front of the top brass. Tolkien, however, falls ill.
It was trench fever. This was a louse-borne disease due to the unhygienic conditions in the trenches.
It spread through contact with lice, and its symptoms aren't very pleasant. It gives you a headache, you can have stomach cramps, you can have pain in your joints and in your bones, you can get lesions on your skin. It's not fatal, but it can become very debilitating. So debilitating you can't be an effective soldier. Tolkien got a very bad case, so bad that he had to be invalided back to Blighty, as they put it. And in fact, it was the end of his war.
It saved Tolkien's life. It took him out of the battlefield and back to Britain. He was shipped home to Birmingham, to the first Southern General Hospital, as it was called at the time, which was actually set up in the grounds of Birmingham University. And it was there that Tolkien was reunited with his wife, Edith, and where he began writing the first stories of Middle-earth. His reunion with Edith was deeply emotional and was an inspiration for various pieces of writing in his mythology, notably the story of Luthien and Beren, which features in the Silmarillion and is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, a love story between a mortal man and an immortal elf.
However, Tolkien's respite is short-lived. Shortly after returning to Birmingham, Tolkien learns from Christopher Wiseman that good friend G.B. Smith has been killed.
The Battle of the Somme was over, and Smith had been organising a football match for his men about 4 miles behind the front line when a stray shell exploded near him. He was hit by shrapnel and developed what they call gas gangrene, which killed him within a few days. Early in 1916, while Tolkien was still in training, he had a letter from G.B. Smith, who by that time was in the trenches in France.
Smith was about to go out on night patrol. The officer who had led the patrol the night before had been captured, and most likely killed.
It was about the most dangerous activity that you could do on the Western Front, and Smith was about to go into it, and he took the opportunity to write to Tolkien and tell him, "I'm about to go out on night patrol. I am a wild and wholehearted admirer of what you've written and what you will write." He told Tolkien, "You, I'm sure, are chosen, and you must publish." Smith was essentially the first Middle-earth fan.
Smith says in the letter that death couldn't put an end to the TCBS, to the Immortal Four, as he put it. That Tolkien may say the things that he had wanted to say long after he is there to say them. That's very moving because Tolkien, although very much his own individual artistic self, I think did see his later career as an attempt to fulfill the artistic dreams that they'd shared.
He was able to gather his strength and perhaps see Smith as an ideal to be lived up to.
In the summer of 1918, Tolkien and Wiseman gather some of Smith's poems and have them published in a small volume entitled A Spring Harvest. Tolkien's war is over, but the impact of his experiences will stay with him forever, and will even feature in his future writings.
The whole experience of the war had an ongoing effect on much of Tolkien's mythology. As soon as Tolkien returned from the Somme, he started writing a story called The Fall of Gondolin, which was the first element in his mythology that dealt with battle. And the fascinating thing about it is that the attacking forces use things that are termed by Tolkien dragons or beasts or monsters, but they're described as metallic and rolling, and they spout fire, and some of them have troops inside them. And it's pretty clear that this is a kind of mythologizing of the tank, which was Britain's secret weapon that had just been launched on the Somme while Tolkien was there. The Lord of the Rings focuses on a fellowship. They're separated on different battlefronts, much as the TCBS were.
It's almost unimaginable that in writing of the breaking of the fellowship in The Lord of the Rings, that Tolkien would not have been influenced by his own loss during the First World War and the breaking of the TCBS fellowship. There is a late letter in which he mentions that the dead marshes through which Frodo, Sam and Gollum travel owe something to northern France in the area of the Somme where he fought.
Frodo and Sam are very much the equivalent of an officer and his Batman, his servant. And Tolkien actually said that my Sam Gamgee is inspired by the privates and batmen I knew in the First World War. Frodo represents really the feelings of a young man like Tolkien himself, thrown into a war unwillingly and having to shoulder a terrible burden, the burden of duty. You can see that Frodo develops symptoms of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or war trauma, or what they called then shell shock. He becomes withdrawn from the world, increasingly enclosed within himself. He says he can't remember what grass was like, what sunlight was like. When the war is over in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo does not strut his stuff as a hero. He's visibly traumatized by the whole experience. This was very true of many of the soldiers who returned from the Western Front, unable to talk about the experiences that had affected them so deeply.
The generation that fights the First World War should be called courageous.
The sacrifice of that generation was extraordinary.
It was a tragic loss, not only for families, for friends, but for civilization as a whole. It shook long-held beliefs and assumptions in honour and glory.
It is the first thoroughgoing war of the machines. So many thousands and ultimately millions of men could be wiped out, could be destroyed without necessarily facing their individual enemy.
These men don't have the privilege of dying one at a time. They die en masse, and it's those numbers that I think traumatise us so much. That's why we have the memorials at Thiepval and Menin Gate, where it's just one long list of names. These bodies have simply disappeared, and they're all separate lives, but they've all vanished at once.
When you read the King Edward School Chronicle, as I have for several years to research Tolkien's life here, you get to know the boys with whom he grew up, and you see their achievements, you see what they were learning, you see how wonderfully intelligent, potentially creative and brilliant they were. And then the First World War, and you see that they're heading for this.
These young men, with their whole lives in front of them, have, yes, it's a phrase we all know, have been cut off in their prime. That they were full of potential, full of life, full of vigour, full of plans, full of ambition, wanting to do all kinds of things with their professional lives and their personal lives, and denied that opportunity.
When you look at the fortunes of war, it's quite astonishing that Tolkien survived and went on to produce great works of literature that he did, works that have shaped our culture. And one does wonder how many others didn't survive, what potential was locked inside them that they never had time to bring out of themselves. So there is an uncountable loss there.
G.B. Smith gives a brief glimpse of a young life snuffed out and only very incompletely communicating its dreams.
This is a generation that did not talk about the way it felt. So in that sense, I think the psychological effect was long-lasting. A number of veterans survived the war only to find that they couldn't survive the peace.
In the chapel at King Edward's School, 8 brass plaques hold the names of 245 old Edwardians who lost their lives during the First World War. Tolkien and his TCBS friends are just 4 of almost 1,500 old Edwardians who answered their country's call and fought in the Great War. And each of their stories is worth telling.
The graveyards that you can walk around in northern France now have become almost 21st century cathedrals, where some really important questions have to be asked about the nature of war and the nature of sacrifice. And in the First World War's case, the scale of that sacrifice, whether any war could be worth that.